What sex addiction isn't is maybe more confusing than what sex addiction is. We know that there is a big, wide spectrum of sexuality and sexual behaviors. And there's nothing on it that is inherently healthy or unhealthy, addictive or not addictive. When we're talking about sex addiction, it really comes down to how you are engaging with that behavior, not the behavior itself. Now, there is an exception to that rule. Any non-consensual behavior is always unhealthy. We're defining non-consensual as someone being unable to give consent. Now, that either means they're underage, they are unconscious, or they are under the influence. Or they're not human at all. They're another being that can't possibly give consent to human behavior. Anything in that regard, in that realm, is always unhealthy. And that includes watching content where there's non-consent happening. Same thing, someone's unconscious, they're under the influence, they're underage, or they are absolutely unable to give consent to human sexual behaviors, activities. Those are not necessarily sex addiction. We have this idea in our society that sex addiction is all perverts and pedophiles and illegal activity. That's not true. Folks who engage in those behaviors might have sex addiction, or they might not. It might be something else entirely. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have sex addiction if you are engaged in those. And it doesn't mean you don't have it if you're not. So for that, we want to go back to that criteria that we talked about in the previous section with regard to what actually goes into diagnosing someone with sex addiction. It's not a high sex drive. It's not a strong desire to engage in sexual behavior. Sex addiction is, as we discussed, unwanted sexual behavior that one has lost control over. It's not a matter of how often you have sex or how often you want to have sex. It really comes down to, are you able to be in control of it, or has it gotten to a place of being compulsive or fitting into that criteria? Now, we're going to talk more in a further section about where sex addiction comes from. And you'll find there that it is an attempt to meet appropriate needs in inappropriate ways. We have found a way to alter our body's chemistry through sexual thoughts and behaviors. But it's not the thoughts and behaviors themselves that are the deeper problem. That might be super weird. We're going to talk more about that later. But to be clear, sex addiction is not a high sex drive. It's not the type of behavior you are engaging in or wanting to engage in. It is not the frequency of which you want to engage in behavior unless it fits that criteria from before. If you are engaged in something that is outside of our conventional idea of sex, but it is healthy for you, that doesn't mean that you have sex addiction, just because some people don't agree with what you're doing. So if you're concerned with any of your thoughts, any of your behaviors, any of your desires, go back to that list of criteria and see if it's linking up with any of that stuff. Just open up a space for exploration, to be honest with yourself, with if how you're engaging with anything in the sexual realm, and again, that's a wide spectrum, fits that criteria. If it doesn't, does it have the possibility of it? Are you lower on that scale of progression? Or is it something that you're feeling really good about? Now, I don't mean you're feeling pleasure in, because let's be real, that's what sex is for, but it feels energizing. It feels true to who you really are. Well, then even if it's deemed a risque behavior or a kink, then that's not necessarily sex addiction itself. So do some deeper investigating on your behaviors, how you are interacting with them, and that list of criteria. There's nothing inherently wrong with you. just in general, just a general statement. Our sexuality is tied so closely to our humanity that when we meet shame in one, it comes over to the other. We'll talk more about that later, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of what sex addiction isn't. And we'll talk next about how sex addiction might show up on that wide spectrum. So I'll see you in that next section.